Swiss style, also known as International Typographic Style, was developed in Switzerland beginning in the 1930s and is still very prominent today. Swiss style uses a system of visual strategies to simplify communication on a global scale. Through experimentation with grids, asymmetrical layouts, sans serif typography, minimalism, and more, Swiss design created a new form of visual communication. Switzerland has a long history of holding graphic design in high regard. The government regularly held competitions for the design of banknotes, postage stamps, and national event posters. Each town and district in Switzerland has a highly graphic flag design to create a unique local identity. Globally, Switzerland has a reputation for their high standards of design, manufacturing, and printed material. World War I swept over the world and has been declared the deadliest war in human history. During the war, Switzerland remained neutral. This proved difficult due to its geographic position between the two opposing fronts. Switzerland became a sanctuary for wounded soldiers, political refugees, pacifists, and deserters. Their day-to-day life was generally unaffected by the war. At the end of World War I, the Spanish flu plagued the globe. Much like the present-day US, there was political turmoil, protest, and a demand for change. These protests in Switzerland were centered around the labor movement and class struggles, which drove a unified movement of artists known as the Modernists to create revolutionary art. Many artists turned to design in the hopes of building power by uniting art and industry.
One of the most influential design movements of the time was the Bauhaus. The Bauhaus was a German art school briefly opened from 1919 to 1933 until the Nazis shut it down. Their philosophy had a profound effect on modern designers, with their motto being "Form follows function." They stripped down their aesthetic to the essentials, using grids, geometric shapes, and primary colors. They used simplicity as a design tool, which would greatly influence the upcoming designers. The Bauhaus also inspired a trend of making new typefaces. The intention was to make typefaces that felt new and modern, and that were free of the nationalism associated with the Nazi Party, and that didn't have a historical context or associations with the past. Designers were also greatly influenced at the time by Jan Gestolt's book, The New Typography. This book served as guidelines for designers to follow. The principles encouraged the use of asymmetry, hierarchy, white space, and sans serif typography.
During World War II, Nazi leaders wanted to control people not only politically but culturally. There were several forms of art that were deemed degenerate by the Nazi regime, and thus these pieces were confiscated and forms of art following suit were suppressed. This was the reason the Nazis shut down the Bauhaus, because they deemed it degenerate. Nationalist design and propaganda from the Nazis contrasted starkly with Swiss design. Propaganda, such as the poster above, relied heavily on illustrative realism, and the focus was on people. Many of the other propaganda posters at the time followed suit, whereas as we can see with the Swiss design poster, there are more bright colors with a much less muted palette, and the focus of the design lies heavily on the actual text, not just the illustrations. In other parts of Europe, avant-garde designers were also protesting nationalistic design as well. Europe was seeing new modernist styles influence graphic design in many countries, including suprematism, constructivism in Russia, and De Stijl in the Netherlands. These avant-garde movements would also heavily influence the upcoming Swiss style as well.
When World War II broke out, Switzerland again remained as neutral as possible, though this time suffering from accidental bombings and aircraft combat within their borders. Switzerland's neutrality during the war was reflected in the appearance of Swiss design. Compositions were displayed functionally and practically without emotional influence. These designs were free from wartime chaos and polarity between sides.
Amongst the chaos and destruction of World War II, Swiss design was a breath of fresh air. The clean and informative Swiss style allowed people to communicate in a new way that was important to commerce. Post World War II, there was a need for design that would help the new economy to flourish. This was appealing to the masses who were yearning for a life away from the war. The calming elements of Swiss design could be considered a soothing escape to the situation happening.
Global capitalism emerged after World War II. This international trade movement was extremely competitive and fast-moving. There was now a huge demand for a new form of graphic communication between different trade partners. Corporations and institutions needed something direct, clear, and unified to get their messages across. Swiss design became the visual counterpart necessary for global capitalism to turn. Swiss style became international typographic style once it was adopted by other countries during the global capitalism boom. Designers from all over the world took Swiss design principles and ethos and applied them for their needs. Due to its high level of accessibility, this design style became a popular and effective choice wherever the printed word was used.
Swiss style became to appear most prominently around the 1950s. The leaders in this style arose from the Zurich School of Arts and Crafts and the Basel School of Design, where they saw poster design as the most effective means of communication. Their posters used sans serif typography, grids, asymmetrical layouts, and photography with the intention of being simple, neutral, and legible. Prior to Swiss style, the dominating typeface inspired by the Bauhaus movement was geometric sans serifs. These typefaces were stripped down of flourishes and were based on geometric shapes for their design. However, because geometric sans serifs were too stylized and difficult to read, Swiss designers avoided them and instead adopted the use of grotesque and neo-grotesque typefaces, primarily Accidens Grotesque, Universe, and Helvetica. They chose these typefaces for their readability across many sizes and formats. Accidens Grotesque originated in the late 19th century and is classified as a grotesque typeface, which means sans serif. Accidens in German translates to jobbing, which refers to its intended use for commercial print use. The use of accidens dipped in the 1920s when geometric sans serifs became more popular. It wasn't until the Swiss style adopted it as their preferred typeface post-World War II that it became well known again. When Jan Gistol released the new typography, it was actually printed in a sans serif similar to Accidens instead of one of the geometric sans serifs. Like the Swiss designers, he preferred it because it was easy to read. The next typeface Swiss designers preferred was Universe. Universe was designed by the Swiss designer Adrian Fudiger and was released in 1957. It is classified as a neo-grotesque and was based off of Accidens. Neo-grotesques are simply a more refined version of grotesque typefaces, where there are less curves and variations in line weight. Universe was known for having a large range and variety in its family so that it could be used in more types of productions. This provided a more consistent appearance in documents. Fudiger described his typeface as having a visual sensitivity between thick and thin strokes and avoided the perfect geometry of geometric sans serifs. He also thought of his typeface as more formal than the upcoming Helvetica that would be released that same year. Fudiger said, "Helvetica is the jeans and Universe the dinner jacket." This brings us to Helvetica, known by some as a friendlier typeface than Universe. Released the same year as Universe in 1957, Helvetica was designed by Swiss designer Max Meidinger in collaboration with Edward Hoffman. And similar to Universe, the intentions behind Helvetica were to have a neutral and legible typeface that could be used on a variety of signage. Helvetica is also a neo-grotesque and was inspired by Accidens as well. It is thought of as being better balanced than its influences, and because of its tall X height, it is easy to read at a distance. In the movie Helvetica, Dutch designer Wim Krol said, "Helvetica was a real step from the 19th century typeface. We were impressed by that because it was more neutral, and neutralism was a word that we loved. It should be neutral. It shouldn't have a meaning in itself. The meaning is in the content of the text and not in the typeface.
In many ways, Swiss design reflected the feelings of post-war Switzerland. During the World Wars, buildings and cities were bombed into rubble all over Europe. Within Swiss design, there is a strong sense of structure and organization to the design elements that could be tied to the desire for a more stable environment.
The Swiss grid system was developed in 1960 by Armin Hoffmann, Emil Reuter, and Joseph Müller-Brockmann. In a country with 4 officially spoken languages, it was created out of a need for clarity and functionality. Apart from being a great tool to communicate to the masses, the style stayed neutral by not using design trends that were associated with any single country.
Because Romantic languages read from left to right, Swiss design often favored aligning the text to the left side of the page and leaving a ragged right. This user-minded typographic alignment choice led to asymmetrical layouts. These designs often used balancing of the shape masses to produce unity and resolve.
Communication through simplicity is one of the driving forces of Swiss design. The goal is to deliver the message in a minimalist and concise way without distracting the viewer with too many ornamental graphic elements. White space is a tool used to generate a simple layout and maintain harmony in the layout. Also considered as negative space, white space helps legibility by separating graphic elements to help guide the eye to where the information is. White space gives the viewer breathing room and lets their eyes rest between elements.
Swiss design favored photography over illustration because it was objective and a more clear and direct form of communication. One trademark innovation of this new photography style was to increase the contrast between the subject and the background of the photo to isolate the subject. One of the most monumental innovations of Swiss design is the use of photography and minimalism. Before Swiss design, products were more typically displayed in the context that they were used. After Swiss design, products were displayed using precise photographic images and minimal background distraction. In modern capitalism, this form of displaying products at the center of an ad has become a new standard. The focus has shifted from people's experience to products being a solution to their problems. The ripple of Swiss design can be seen all around us in packaging, advertisement, signage, and artwork. Many governments around the world have employed the typefaces and page layouts. Swiss design's influence has become so familiar to the modern world through decades of exposure, reiteration, and evolution that is accepted as a common solution to graphic problems without a second thought.
Chris Ashworth was the art director and designer of a California-based music magazine called Raygun for 15 issues between 1997 to 1998. He developed a hybrid method called Swiss Grit, combining the Swiss style with a more grungy and handcrafted approach. All the issues of this magazine were designed from scratch, and the grid systems were never repeated.
Because Swiss designers chose typefaces for their legibility and neutrality, this effectiveness became very well known, and these typefaces were adopted all over the world. Corporations, governments, and especially transportation systems use these typefaces for their consistent readability in both small and large sizes across many different formats.
Swiss design is a pillar of design today. We can see it reflected in the world around us, whether it be its influence on architecture or the media we consume. It's become more than just a design style, it's become a part of the economy. Throughout the years, despite the changes in the world, many designers still turn to the elements of Swiss design for inspiration. In the future years to come, Swiss style will continue to thrive and survive.